story that, well, it fascinates me. And it fascinates me because I believe that it is a huge miscarriage of justice. I'm joined on the screen, as you can see, by Dr. Sandra Lean. Good morning, Sandra.
Morning, Sonia.
And I'm joined by author Scott Forbes. Good morning, Scott.
Good morning, Sonia. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. It's really good to see you both. Thank you so much for joining me at this, well, interesting hour, frankly. Now, you're joining me to talk about the conviction of Luke Mitchell. For anybody who isn't familiar, in June 2003, 14-year-old Scottish schoolgirl Jodi Jones was brutally murdered, and I mean brutally. And she was dumped in Dalkeith, Edinburgh. Her 14-year-old boyfriend at the time, Luke Mitchell, was prime suspect from the beginning. And as I say, today I'm joined by author Scott Forbes and case expert Dr. Sandra Lean. Dr. Sandra, you've written a book called Innocence Betrayed, which is TS as opposed to innocence. And I like that play on words. And Scott, you've just published a new book, which is The Long Walk to Justice? I think that's correct, isn't it? And
Yes.
And I think it's fair to say that both of you are in no doubt whatsoever that Luke Mitchell was wrongly imprisoned, and it's both an injustice to both Jodi and Luke.
Absolutely.
Right. First of all, let's go to you then, Scott. Again, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Why did you write this book, Scott?
So, Sonia, I've been wanting to write this book for some years. Myself and Dr. Lean have spoken about it for 10 years maybe. Only because I've seen it from a different perspective to others. I'm from the area, I know the mining villages, and listen, my involvement for the case for day one has been frustrating, very frustrating. Channel 5 done a great programme. The Murder in a Small Town was brilliant. Sandra's book's fantastic, factually, and I just thought there was something missing. There was something missing that had to be said. It wasn't being permitted to be said on television in Sandra's book. So I decided during COVID, I was just, it was time to eventually put everything out.
The thing is that many experts now conclude that there is something very desperately wrong with this case and the conclusion and conviction of Luke. And Sandra, you were both you and Scott were both in the Channel 5 documentary. And as anybody who knows me knows, I can be highly critical of the output from legacy media, but it is an excellent two-part documentary that I highly recommend. It's on the iPlayer of Channel 5. It was actually repeated again this week because it's vital. And Sandra, one of the things that I think throws people about this case is that there was no forensic evidence linking Luke to the crime scene, but there was DNA from other people. Could you tell us more about that?
That was probably one of the most shocking. Once we got access to the case papers, now you have to remember this is 5, 6 years, 7 years actually after the murder, when we got access to the case papers and the forensic results. Now, I was an ordinary mum. I had no knowledge of all this stuff. I had to go and study everything. And I'm looking at these DNA results going, that cannot be correct. And it was. Nothing of Luke at the crime scene, on the body, nothing of Jodi in his home, on his clothing, nothing. And then you find DNA from others on the clothing at the crime scene. The condom, the used condom found within yards of the body, both the appeal court and the SCCRC thought this was of no significance. There's a 14-year-old girl stripped naked, and there's a used condom with what they called fresh semen. That's not my words, that's theirs. And they thought that was of no consequence. It blew my mind. I've never experienced anything like it.
And we are talking about a level of savagery. The mutilation of poor Jodi looked ritualistic. Her hands were tied behind her back using her own trousers. She'd obviously put up a fight. Her throat had been cut multiple times. It was an absolute bloodbath. Anybody involved would have been covered. There's no question about it, because blood spurt does that. And obviously one of the DNA matches was Stephen Kelly, which was Jodi's sister's boyfriend. And at trial, they said that Jodi had borrowed her sister's boyfriend's t-shirt that night, and that was the explanation for that. But the other interesting thing that I find about this is that you actually had a direct communication with somebody who had shown up, Scott, at your home the day after. Mark Kane, tell us about that.
Well, yeah, genuinely, Mark Kane could have been written out of this whole case if the police had interviewed him. He came to my home the morning after Jodi was murdered. He had never been in my flat in Leith, and the police asked for anyone who had left the local community with visible signs of being in a struggle. And when Mark Kane turns up at my flat, he's got really deep scratches in his face. His eye was bloodshot. Jamie Nolan, a girl, Jamie Nolan, told him to take his glasses off. And when he took them off, I asked him, what happened? What happened to your face, Mark? He couldn't tell me, but I knew he was telling me he was in the woods at New Battle Road, where Fleming and Reid allegedly saw Luke. He admits walking up that road, going to an off licence up in the local village. He's in the woods, he's full of methadone, speed. He's got a real bad history, violence towards animals. I mean, real bad cruelty to animals. So I asked him where he had been and how he got his scratches. He couldn't answer me. So I took him to the police. Now, the police files, as Sandra will confirm, is Mark Kane to be traced and questioned. And he was never questioned until after Luke Mitchell was convicted. So we've got a boy who looked quite like Luke. History, violence, history, cruelty to animals. He's in the area at the time of the murder. He's got scratches on his face, and the police didn't even bother.
It's most bizarre. And of course, Mark is now dead. Yes. So that's one line of inquiry that can't be explored anyway now. I mean, some of the shocking things, Sandra, to me seemed very much that Luke was targeted right from the get-go, because he was, you know, he was part of that whole kind of goth movement, wasn't he? Or was he? Or was he not?
That's a bit of a misunderstanding. He was painted as part of the goth movement. But if you look at the media coverage back then, 2003, he wasn't a goth. He was, I think, now my girls will go nuts at me if I get this wrong. I think he was a skater.
Oh, a skater boy.
Yeah. So he had blonde hair. He didn't wear the dark makeup or anything like that. Jodi was starting to dabble in the goth culture, and her sister was massively into the goth culture. But
interesting.
Not Luke. So the reason for targeting him from the beginning is nothing to do with what he looked like. We know now that those first two police officers who responded to the missing person call left Jodi's mother's house under the impression that Jodi had left at tea time with Luke, and now Luke was saying he hadn't seen her. Now you can see why they would be suspicious, but that is not true. Jodi did not leave her home with Luke at tea time.
Right. This is exactly why it's so important to speak with both of you, because we need to get rid of these myths. Because how long has Luke been imprisoned now?
17 years.
Yeah. 17 years. And what you pointed out to me yesterday, Sandra, is this young man, who all three of us believe is subject to a miscarriage of justice, has been in prison longer than he actually lived the beginning of his life outside of prison, which is extraordinary. And one of the things that we know was that Luke was with other lads when Jodi's body was found, but the police were only interested in him. And again, why do you think that was, Sandra?
There was a misunderstanding. So when Jodi's body was found, he was with three members of her family: her sister, her sister's boyfriend, and her gran, her 67-year-old gran. Why it was those three who went out looking for Jodi at that time of night, nobody knows. But when the police arrived, they assumed that only Luke had been over the wall and only Luke had found the body. Right. And they seemed to be of the impression that the other three had arrived later. But that's not what happened. They all went down at the Gran's suggestion. Luke had come up the path. They intercepted him at the top of the path, and the Gran suggested a double check. Had that double check not been suggested, Luke Mitchell could not have been accused of leading the family to the body. And it wasn't even him that suggested it.
That's phenomenal. See, these things are so vital, so important. I was listening to a podcast that you'd both made together, and I think this is right. You were talking with Scott about, is it about the man in the red jumper? Is that, did I get that right? Scott, what can you tell us about the man in the red jumper, obviously without libeling anybody?
No, well, listen, we genuinely never got a name, Sonia. We've got a man running 200 yards, 300 yards away from where Jodi's found. The description is he's running like a bat out of hell. No consideration for himself or his safety as he runs in front of cars. So somebody is frightened or appears to be frightened, running away from the scene, and he was never ever traced. The police made one attempt, we believe. They went to a local tattoo shop, and they asked the local tattooist if he knew who this man in this red sweatshirt was, and that was the end of inquiry. We've never been able to find them.
It was like they had who they wanted, and it was like almost like a foregone conclusion. And I think really shocking. And I'm not sure whether it was you who said it, Sandra, or Luke's mum. But it was really what we're dealing with here, and seems more apparent as the years go by, is the police informed the media, and the media informed the public that it was Luke, and everything else conspired to make it look like it was Luke. And of course, as you say, no forensic evidence linking him to the crime scene. He's maintained his innocence since the beginning, hasn't he, Sandra?
Yes, and he's on record as saying he will come out of prison an innocent man. And until that is the case, if he has to spend the rest of his life in jail until he clears his name, that is what will happen. Now, that's extraordinary. He was 15 years old when he was incarcerated, and he's still, I spoke to him last night, and he's still to this day saying, I will never admit to something I didn't do. And if that means I have to stay here, I'll clear my name one day.
I mean, what do you think because what you said to me is you want them to go back to ground zero. In an ideal world, you would like a Hillsborough type panel, an independent panel, because at this moment in time, the involvement of all the authorities around Luke's case has to be in question, to be. So why should anybody trust them to sort of examine themselves? So it does need an independent inquiry. So what do you feel? I mean, given the passage of time and everything else, Sandra, do you feel that there still could be a truthful answer to who murdered Jodi?
Yes, I do. And part of the reason for that, and Scott will confirm this, is right up until now, we have people coming forward and saying, we tried to tell the police at the time and they wouldn't take our statements, or we had these concerns and we tried to express them to various authorities and they wouldn't listen. So we still have people right up until now with information that is not in those files.
See, the thing is that it reminds me in some respects to the Jeremy Bamber case, which I believe also is a miscarriage of justice. And you see, the thing is, obviously, we know that once police become fixated, it's like it's a process then of just, let's prove it. But Scott, Luke's conviction was purely circumstantial. There's no other way to describe it, right? And what about witnesses who claim to have seen him but couldn't identify him in court?
So a lot of things here. Andrina Bryson, allegedly she's Luke Mitchell. She drives along the road at 30 miles an hour looking into a lane. My research tells me Andrina Bryson never seen nothing. Andrina Bryson was speaking on behalf of her husband, who allegedly seen Luke, and because of her drug problems, she come forward to do good. Now that's allegedly, but when she gets to court, they ask him, can you see Luke Mitchell? And she can't identify. Now, I interviewed Andrina Bryson, 2010, a solicitor Graham man. 2 years track her down to her house. We turn up, she's there with her mother-in-law and her husband. And all we asked one question was, see, when you go to court, Miss Bryson, had Luke changed his appearance? For why you couldn't? And we go, oh, that's it, stop the interview. The mother-in-law jumps up, get out. He's putting more. We told her, Luke, I've only asked one question. The interview was finished. Andrea Bryson was like a rabbit in the headlights when I spoke to her, Sonia. This is way back in 2010, 2011 we tracked her. I've spoke to a couple of witnesses, Sonia, young children. They were children at the time. Without telling me, there have been years of counselling because of the bullying of the police. Police putting words in their mouth. When the narrative didn't agree, they were back at these children. The children now telling them, no children now, they're 30s. Are now that hurt and heartbroken that they actually believed that Luke Mitchell could have been the killer because the police had put that much pressure on them.
Right.
So this isn't uncommon in this case.
Right. We cannot, as I say already, but we cannot understate the involvement of the media in this case. We cannot. Sandra, how key do you think it was, the interview that Luke and his mum did on the day of Jodi's funeral with Sky News? How key was that in the turn of events that then followed?
In terms of media setup, and I make no apologies for using that term, Sky contacted them and asked what they were doing because Luke couldn't go to the funeral, and Corinne naively invited them in to film the vigil that they were having. Now, what preceded was essentially a police interrogation by a reporter. He was asking questions that the police would have had to ask under caution. And what they did there was they set up the case against Luke Mitchell for the whole world to see before he'd been charged, before any arrest had been made, and done in such a way that even if you watch the video on its own, I think there's nothing particularly untoward about it. But the headlines that went with it, the screeching, how could you, disrespectful, goading Jodi's family. The lad was grieving and they manipulated that.
It's horrendous, actually. I don't even think it would be allowed now.
No.
I mean, like psychologists would be leaping all over it. I mean, it's just horrendous. It really, and when you watch it back, you realize what's going on there.
Yeah.
You do. Even, I mean, I don't think you need to be a journalist to realize that kid was being set up.
Yeah.
Right.
And you have to remember as well, he was heavily medicated.
Heavily traumatized, heavily medicated. The police know this. He's got glazed eyes, and they turned these glazed eyes into, instead of being traumatized and drugged up, they turned that into wide-eyed, mental and bad and evil.
Of course they did. Of course they did. The things that they said about him was shocking. Spawn of Satan was one of the headlines. Horrendous. Yeah. Scott, I mean, obviously we're all entitled to our opinions, but I get the idea that the suggestion of your book really is that the police knew what was going on, and they're actually involved in a cover-up. Have I got that right?
Yes. Sonia, I've never took the whole faith jump. I've got some very close people to me who believe that the police set up. I've never went that far. People have said they were protecting someone else. I've never went that far. However, what I do, and I'm 100% sure it's from my opinion, from an hour of finding Jodi, Lothian Borders Police, Dalkeith CID made Luke Mitchell their only suspect. Yep. Now, they let Alice Walker go home. She was sitting in a police station, and they allowed her to go home. They drove her to another house, Joseph John's house, for a cup of tea, so everything's contaminated. When the report came back on the 16th, which cleared Luke, in my opinion, cleared them because there's no forensic links. They went too far into believing Luke Mitchell was the one, and they just kept going. My opinion now, Craig Dobie, the detective that led it, I believe is criminally negligent.
Yep.
He knew, in my opinion, listen, it doesn't take a great genius mind to read this case. I'm not putting anybody down or putting anybody up. If you read this case, the fact sheet, and you look at the case files, within very short time, you know that Luke Mitchell did not kill Jodi Jones. Yeah. Now, DCS Dobie must have knew that also. And the fact that he played the media within 3 days, no other suspects, we're not looking for anyone else, that's telling the public that Luke Mitchell did it.
Yeah.
Now, Sonia, listen, I keep looking at this case and there's nothing. I keep emphasising this fact in layman's terms. There is no evidence.
It's like they're on a path and they don't want to turn back because, well, the amount of problems that come from admitting a miscarriage of justice is just tremendous. And obviously people not just lose faith, but I mean, there's so much. There's like financial considerations. The fact that this lad has lost so much. Sandra, you say you spoke to him last night. How does he deal with this? Because he knows the truth of the situation. As I say, all three on this screen believe this is a miscarriage of justice. How does somebody imprisoned at the age of 16 and having spent a significant chunk of their adult life incarcerated, how does he manage to get up every day?
Because he said himself, he is entirely focused on clearing his name. He can't look at what they've taken from him. You know, and I know this from other people fighting miscarriage of justice in prison. In order to stay alive, in order to get up every day and get through that day, their focus is on clearing their name, on finding the evidence, on making the arguments, on proving their innocence. And that, I mean, Luke's remarkable. He has an incredible sense of humour, and that in a lot of ways has really helped get him through this. I mean, you obviously have to have a bit of a dark sense of humour in these circumstances, but he can still laugh about some of the stuff that goes on.
Does he have
in particular the media?
Well, and so he should. We're all laughing at them. Does he have faith that he will eventually be cleared?
Yes. Yes, he has no doubt that the information that's needed to prove, over and above what we already have, to prove it wasn't him, is there. And it's a case of, there are people out there who need to speak. There are people who know things, who haven't been honest. We know this, and I'm begging these people, do the right thing. Do the right thing. This could have been you or somebody you love. Come and speak to us.
Absolutely.
And that's all Luke wants.
Absolutely. That sounds like a perfect note to end on. Thank you both very much for continuing this, because it's so hard. It is, as Scott says, let's see your book, Scott. Hold it up.
Oh, listen, do you know, I've not even got one.
Don't worry, I thought that's what you were just about to do.
No, I've not even got one.
Please, no, don't worry. Please, everybody, check out Long Walk to Justice by Scott Forbes and Innocence Betrayed by Dr. Sandra Lean. Really, really vital books. And thank you both very much, both of you,
Sonia,
for continuing this. I know this hasn't been easy on either of you. I know you've been attacked. I know, Sandra, you were like, I've had enough of this world. I'm off to a place of more peace, right? And I completely get that. And you look like you're surrounded by a great deal of beauty and nature there. So I wish you both a wonderful day, and let's all fight for justice for Luke Mitchell and Jodi Jones. Take good care of yourselves, both of you.
Well,
Speak to you.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Sonia.